Imagine standing in an open field, watching a wall of men march toward you. Not a mob, not a charge, a wall. Shields locked edge to edge, spears projecting outward in overlapping rows, the front rank bristling with iron points so dense you can barely see the men holding them. You look for a gap. There isn't one. You look for a weak flank. Someone is already guarding it. And as that wall closes the distance, you realize something that soldiers across the ancient world realized for nearly 3 centuries. There is no good answer to what's coming at you. The Greek Phalanx was one of the most dominant military formations in the history of warfare. For hundreds of years, it won battles, built empires, and carved its reputation into the bones of every civilization that dared to face it head-on. Persian armies broke against it. City-states that tried to copy it without mastering its discipline were crushed by those who had. And yet, here's the paradox that makes this story fascinating. It all eventually collapsed. Against Rome, a formation that had seemed almost mythically unbeatable was torn apart and rendered obsolete. How does something that dominant fail? To answer that, we first need to understand exactly why it was so terrifying to begin with. At its core, the Phalanx was an elegant solution to a brutally simple problem. How do you make individual soldiers more powerful by organizing them together? The answer was density and reach. Greek hoplites stood in tight rectangular formations, typically 8 ranks deep, each man carrying a large round shield called an aspis. The shield didn't just protect its owner, it overlapped with the shield of the man to his left, which means every soldier in the formation was partially protected by his neighbor. Strip one man out, and you don't just lose one fighter, you punch a hole in the entire defensive wall. That mutual dependence is what gave the Phalanx its structural integrity, and it's also what made cohesion and discipline its most critical ingredients. But the shield wall alone wasn't what made the Phalanx revolutionary. It was the spear, and specifically what Philip II of Macedon did with it. The classical Greek spear, the doru, was effective but limited. Philip replaced it with the sarissa, a pike that ranged between 15 and 21 feet in length. Think about what that means in practical terms. When a Macedonian phalanx advanced, the sarissas of the first 5 or 6 ranks all projected beyond the front line simultaneously. An enemy soldier trying to close with the front rank wasn't facing one spear. He was facing a forest of them. He had to somehow push through or deflect 5 overlapping points just to reach the man who was actually trying to kill him. In the meantime, that man was entirely protected, calmly holding his position and adding his own spear to the wall. This is what Philip transformed. He didn't just hand his soldiers longer spears and call it a day. He built a professional military system around those spears. His troops trained relentlessly. They learned to march in formation, to dress their ranks on broken ground, to respond to commands instantly and correctly. The Phalanx went from being a formation that citizen soldiers could execute competently to something that professional warriors could perform with almost mechanical precision. Philip understood that the sarissa's reach advantage was only useful if the men using it were disciplined enough to maintain the formation under pressure. A phalanx that breaks apart is just a crowd of men holding very long sticks. A phalanx that holds together is a killing machine. His son Alexander took this system and used it as the cornerstone of one of history's greatest military minds. But here's something crucial to understand about how Alexander actually fought. He never expected the phalanx to win battles alone. He used it as an anvil. The phalanx would engage an enemy frontally, fixing their infantry in place, keeping them locked in the grinding, terrifying work of pressing against that spear wall. While the enemy was pinned, unable to maneuver without exposing themselves, Alexander would strike with his companion cavalry or the elite hypaspist infantry on the flanks or through any gap that opened. The decisive blow was almost never delivered by the phalanx itself. It was delivered because the phalanx made every other part of the enemy's line vulnerable. At Gaugamela, at Issus, at the Granicus, the pattern repeats. The Persian army, many times larger, couldn't simply mass its forces against Alexander because the phalanx wouldn't break. It absorbed punishment, advanced steadily, and kept Darius's infantry occupied while Alexander himself led the cavalry charge that shattered the Persian command structure. The phalanx didn't need to be mobile or flexible in those moments. It needed to be immovable. And it was. This points to something important about why frontal assaults on a steady phalanx were so consistently catastrophic for the men attempting them. It wasn't just the spears. It was the geometry of the situation. Attacking the front of a disciplined phalanx meant walking into a thicket of iron points you couldn't dodge, couldn't easily cut down, and couldn't outreach. You'd be taking casualties before you could even make contact with the enemy's bodies. And the psychological weight of that, watching men in front of you die before they could raise their own weapons, was enough to break morale long before it broke bodies. Commanders across the ancient world learned this lesson expensively. You did not attack the front of a good phalanx. You looked for its flanks. You looked for broken ground that would disrupt its formation. And if you couldn't find either, you hoped to outlast it somehow. Most couldn't. What's worth stressing here, and what often gets overlooked when people focus on the visual drama of those locked shields and levelled spears, is that the phalanx's fearsome reputation was never just about the pike block itself. It was about everything surrounding it. It was about the months and years of drilling that turned men into a single coordinated unit. It was about the cavalry screening the flanks. It was about the light infantry harassing archers and skirmishers who might otherwise target the phalanx from range. It was about commanders who understood that the phalanx was a tool in a combined arms system, not a magic formation that solved every problem by itself. Take away the discipline, and the phalanx is clumsy and brittle. Take away the supporting arms, and its flanks become catastrophically exposed. Take away the right terrain, and its greatest strength, that dense, cohesive advance, becomes a liability. And that right there is where the story gets interesting, because those vulnerabilities, they were always there, baked into the design from the beginning. For centuries, nobody found a consistent way to exploit them, and then Rome did. So let's pull back the curtain on those vulnerabilities, because understanding them changes everything about how you see the phalanx, and how you understand what eventually destroyed it. Start with the ground beneath the soldiers' feet. This sounds almost too simple to matter, but it was everything. The phalanx was engineered for flat, open terrain. Its power came from the synchronized advance of hundreds or thousands of men moving as a single body. Sarissas levelled, shields locked, every rank pushing forward in unison. On a smooth plain, that coordination was achievable. On broken ground, rocky hillsides, boggy fields, terrain cut by ravines or dry stream beds, it became nearly impossible to maintain. Men stumbled. Gaps opened between soldiers as some moved faster than others to navigate obstacles. The neat rectangular block began to look more like a ragged crowd. And the moment those gaps appeared, the sarissa wall lost its integrity. Individual spears no longer overlapped. The men behind couldn't push evenly. The geometry that made the formation lethal started to collapse into something far more ordinary. The phalanx also depended on uninterrupted forward momentum. When it was moving forward steadily, it was at its most dangerous. A grinding, relentless press of iron points that enemies couldn't get through. But momentum required clear direction, clear ground, and clear command. Slow it down, disrupt its advance with skirmishers harassing the flanks, or introduce any confusion about where the formation was supposed to be going, and that momentum dissolved. A phalanx that stopped advancing became a phalanx that was simply standing there, holding very long spears, while the battle moved around it. That brings us to one of the formation's most crippling physical limitations. It could barely turn. Seriously, Think about what it actually means to execute a 90-degree turn with 10,000 men carrying 18-foot pikes in a tightly packed formation. The sarissa required both hands to hold and control. The soldiers were packed so densely that complex maneuvering wasn't just difficult, it was dangerous. Making a turn under battlefield conditions, while the enemy was actively trying to kill you, while dust and noise and chaos made communication nearly impossible, was a recipe for the formation to fold in on itself. Pursuing broken enemies was almost equally awkward. A phalanx that started chasing routed opponents tended to lose its cohesion rapidly as faster men pulled ahead and the tight formation dissolved into something resembling a mob. This rigidity created a very specific and lethal danger: the flanks and the rear. The front of the phalanx was nearly impenetrable. The flanks and rear were an entirely different story. The men on the edges of the formation were not protected by overlapping shields in the same way as those in the center. They couldn't easily bring their sarissas to bear against threats coming from the side without pivoting the whole unit, which, as we just established, was genuinely difficult to execute in the heat of battle. An enemy cavalry force that managed to swing around the end of the phalanx and strike its rear wasn't facing that wall of iron spears. It was facing the backs of men who had no real way to respond effectively. This is precisely why Alexander was so careful to protect his phalanx's flanks with cavalry and light infantry. He understood the formation's geometry well enough to know that its terrifying front face was also a kind of blind spot, because every ounce of its killing power was directed forward. Contrast that rigidity with a more flexible infantry system, one built around smaller units that could act semi-independently, change direction without unraveling, and respond to unexpected threats from different angles. Such a system sacrificed the raw shock power of the phalanx's locked front in exchange for adaptability. It couldn't necessarily win a head-to-head collision with a good phalanx on perfect terrain, but it could fight on rough ground. It could react when something unexpected happened on one part of the line without the whole formation falling apart. It could attack from multiple angles simultaneously. The phalanx was like a powerful engine that only ran well in one gear. A more flexible system had more gears, even if no single gear was quite as devastating. What made this worse over time was the way Hellenistic kingdoms came to treat the phalanx after Alexander's death. His successors, the Diadochi and their descendants, inherited the prestige of the Macedonian military tradition and clung to it with a kind of cultural pride that sometimes overrode tactical common sense. The phalanx became a symbol of legitimacy, a statement about the power and sophistication of whichever king was fielding it. And so it was deployed even when conditions were unfavourable, on terrain that didn't suit it, without adequate cavalry to screen its flanks, against enemies that had learned to avoid its strengths and probe its weaknesses. The kings wanted the phalanx at the centre of their battle line, because that's where the phalanx had always been, because Alexander had used it there, because it projected authority and military heritage. Whether the terrain and the tactical situation actually demanded it was sometimes a secondary consideration. That gap between prestige and practicality was a slow accumulation of vulnerability. Each time a phalanx was deployed in conditions that didn't suit it, each time flanks were underprotected because a general trusted the formation's fearsome reputation to do what proper combined arms coordination should have done, the weaknesses were exposed a little more clearly to anyone paying attention. And Rome was paying attention. Here is the central puzzle that the rest of this story is built around. The phalanx's weaknesses were not secret. Commanders throughout the Hellenistic world understood, at least intellectually, that rough terrain was dangerous, that flanks needed protection, that flexibility mattered. And yet those weaknesses were repeatedly left unaddressed, because for a long time, no enemy could actually exploit them consistently enough to matter. What changes the story is not the discovery of those weaknesses. It's the emergence of a military system specifically and almost perfectly designed to target them. A system that didn't try to out-phalanx the phalanx, that didn't attempt to beat it at its own game on its own terms. A system that instead looked at the formation's blind spots, its rigidity, its dependence on perfect conditions, and built an entirely different approach around turning those into death sentences. That system was Rome, and what they did next reshaped the entire ancient world. Rome didn't set out to solve the Phalanx as an intellectual exercise. They figured it out the hard way, through decades of brutal warfare against enemies who used it, and through a long process of refining their own military system until it happened to be almost perfectly shaped to exploit everything the Phalanx couldn't handle. The result was the Manipular Legion. And understanding how it worked explains exactly why the Phalanx's days were numbered the moment Rome pointed it in that direction. The Manipular system divided the Roman army into smaller tactical units called maniples, each capable of acting with a degree of independence that the Phalanx simply couldn't match. Instead of one massive block locked into a single formation, the Romans fielded a checkerboard arrangement of units that could be shifted, redeployed, pulled back, sent forward, or swung to cover a threatened point without the entire line unravelling. Their soldiers carried a heavy throwing javelin called a pilum and fought with a short sword at close quarters. Weapons designed for chaos and close contact, not for maintaining a geometric wall of spear points from a distance. Roman commanders at every level, down to the centurion leading 80 men through smoke and noise and confusion, had real authority and real initiative. When something unexpected happened, and in battle, something unexpected always happened, the Roman line could bend, absorb, and respond. The Phalanx could not. The contrast becomes visceral when you put these two systems on actual terrain. On a flat plain, the Phalanx against a Manipular Legion is a genuinely frightening proposition for Rome. That wall of sarissas, properly maintained, was still a nightmare to approach. But the ancient world was not made of flat plains, and battles rarely happened on ground that generals would have designed from scratch. They happened on hillsides, on fields cut by streams and gullies, on terrain that forced formations to stretch and compress and adapt in real time. That is where Rome found its opportunity. Cynoscephalae in 197 BCE is the first great demonstration of this. The Roman general Titus Quinctius Flamininus met the Macedonian king Philip the Stav in Thessaly, on ground that was rolling, uneven, and partially obscured by fog. Neither side intended to fight a set-piece battle that morning. Contact happened almost by accident as advance forces collided. The Macedonians scrambled to deploy their phalanx on ground that was already working against them. Part of the phalanx formed up and advanced with brutal effectiveness, pushing the Romans back wherever it made contact on favourable footing. But the other half of the Macedonian line hadn't finished forming. It was still getting into position when the Roman right wing, having already crushed the enemy in front of them, wheeled and hit the unformed Macedonian half from the flank and rear. The phalanx that was still deploying couldn't respond. Turning to face a new threat meant dismantling the formation under attack, which was nearly impossible while Romans were already driving into them from multiple directions. The sarissas, those weapons that made the phalanx so lethal from the front, became liabilities in a close-quarters melee, where men were fighting at angles and distances the weapon wasn't designed for. The Macedonians, who had been so dangerous 60 seconds earlier, were suddenly helpless, and the slaughter was extraordinary. Philip lost roughly 8,000 men. Rome lost a few hundred. The battle wasn't won by overpowering the phalanx at its strongest point. It was won by making the phalanx fight in conditions where it could barely function. Pydna in 168 BCE takes this lesson even further, and it's worth watching closely because it almost went the other way. The Macedonian king Perseus deployed a magnificent phalanx, well-trained, properly formed, advancing on relatively open ground. The Romans initially fell back. Contemporary sources describe the Roman soldiers throwing down their shields and fleeing, trying to avoid the pike points, genuinely unable to make headway against the Macedonian front. For a moment, it looked like the phalanx might still be the dominant force in the ancient world. Then the ground did what ground always does. As the Phalanx advanced, pursuing the withdrawing Romans across terrain that turned out to be more uneven than it appeared, the formation began to pull apart. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but here and there, gaps opened between units. Men stepped around rocks and into hollows. Some sections advanced faster than others. The smooth geometric front that made the Phalanx invincible began to develop holes. Roman centurions saw those holes and reacted immediately, exactly as they had been trained to do, exactly as their system was designed for. Small units peeled off and drove into the gaps, not attacking the sarissas head-on, but getting inside them. And here is the brutal physics of the situation. A sarissa was 18 feet long. Inside the reach of a sarissa, it was useless. A Roman soldier who had closed to arm's reach was fighting a man who was essentially trying to wrestle with a pole. The short sword, the scutum shield, the training in close quarters brutality, everything about the Roman soldier was designed for exactly this range. The Macedonians, caught in a formation that had lost its coherence, couldn't bring their primary weapon to bear and couldn't easily draw secondary weapons in the crush. The Phalanx didn't just lose at Pydna, it collapsed. Perseus fled. The Macedonian kingdom effectively ended that afternoon. The pattern across both battles is the same, and it's the key insight that everything else rests on. Rome never beat the Phalanx at its best. On perfect flat ground, fully formed, properly supported, with its flanks protected and its momentum intact, the Phalanx was still a terrifying instrument. Rome didn't try to meet that version of the Phalanx directly. What Rome did, consistently and devastatingly, was to ensure that the Phalanx never got to fight on its own terms. They used terrain, they used disruption, they used the flexibility of the manipular system to find the moments when the Macedonian formation was vulnerable and hit those moments with everything they had. They understood the Phalanx's assumptions: flat ground, maintained formation, uninterrupted momentum, protected flanks, and they systematically denied every one of them. This is the larger truth that makes the story of the Phalanx and Rome worth understanding beyond the military history. No system is invincible. Every formation, every doctrine, every strategic approach is built on a set of assumptions about conditions, terrain, and enemy behavior. The Phalanx was perfectly adapted to its assumptions. It was nearly unbeatable when those assumptions held. But assumptions can be identified, analyzed, and undermined. And once an adversary builds a system specifically designed to violate those assumptions, the dominant force becomes vulnerable almost overnight. The Phalanx ruled the ancient battlefield for over a century because no one had yet developed the combination of insight and capability required to consistently deny it the conditions it needed. Rome had both. And the moment that happened, one of the most feared military formations in human history became, in the right circumstances, a liability rather than an asset. If this breakdown of ancient military thinking changed how you see the history, subscribe and hit the bell. There's plenty more where that came from.